The chamber of the Galactic Council radiated grandeur, with its vaulted ceilings and layered tiers of alien representatives watching from on high. Voices filled the air with the hum of translated tones, each word carefully modulated, every gesture steeped in ritual that had defined centuries of interstellar governance. They prided themselves on order, on the belief that every species eventually bent to the rules of their assembly. To them, humanity's presence was not an act of equality but a test of how well an unruly species could be tamed. They told themselves this repeatedly, to steady the unease growing beneath the polished surface of their deliberations. Humans sat at a long stone table near the center, their delegation silent, expressions unreadable, their posture rigid and deliberate. The council elders viewed this composure as hesitant submission. In their eyes, the Terrans had been forced to the table after a string of costly engagements, their fleets bloodied, their colonies battered. They believed humans had finally grasped the futility of defying the balance of power. Yet every time their eyes fell on the human faces, the absence of deferential gestures felt unsettling. There were no nods, no bows, no acknowledgments of hierarchy. Just watchful silence. The council's leading orator began with a carefully rehearsed overture. Words of supposed goodwill were wrapped around threats, assurances of peace cloaked in language of control. He reminded the chamber of how civilizations rose when they embraced the council's guidance and fell when they resisted. He recited examples, ancient empires broken until they swore allegiance to collective rule. His gaze frequently rested on the humans, as though daring them to contradict his narrative. The chamber rippled with approving gestures from species that had long been part of this structure, all too eager to reinforce the belief that humanity's presence marked the continuation of tradition. The human delegation did not flinch. Their eyes remained fixed, their faces impassive. One leaned back slightly, hands folded, every movement deliberate, as if measuring each second with care. The absence of visible reaction was its own message. For the council, however, this restraint was misread as exhaustion, the final signs of a species beaten into compliance. They whispered among themselves, interpreting silence as a concession, failing to grasp that silence could be something sharper, more dangerous. Alien delegates across the tiers exchanged signals, approving statements of superiority. They muttered about how Earth's people had fought valiantly but lacked the centuries of experience necessary to govern themselves responsibly. Some suggested the humans be commended for choosing dialogue over further bloodshed, though the tone was dismissive, as if praising a child for learning obedience. Others spoke of reparations, not yet formally presented but already assumed, the price for daring to challenge the established order. The humans listened, still unmoved, their silence more cutting than any argument. Every ornate phrase delivered by the council was another brick in the wall they believed they were building around humanity. They congratulated themselves on securing the presence of Terrans at all, blind to the fact that every word only deepened the coldness on human faces. The council saw hesitation where there was discipline, humility where there was calculation, defeat where there was only restraint. The hall shimmered with layered lights from crystalline walls, an environment designed to impress, to overwhelm visitors with scale and splendor. For countless species, this architecture had been enough to inspire reverence. Yet for humans, the shine of alien opulence stirred no awe. Their eyes lingered only briefly, returning quickly to the council itself, to the words, to the intent behind them. They were not guests here, not supplicants. They were observers in a place that mistook its own power for permanence. The council's assumptions deepened with each passing moment. They spoke with louder confidence, interpreting the lack of human interruption as progress. The chamber buzzed with smug certainty, its members congratulating themselves for keeping the wild species within bounds. But the humans exchanged brief, wordless glances, barely perceptible shifts that carried more weight than speeches. A flicker of agreement, a flash of shared recognition, subtle signals unseen or ignored by those convinced of their own dominance. The final statements of the day were layered with condescension. Promises of inclusion, veiled ultimatums about compliance, patronizing acknowledgments of human bravery paired with warnings about the cost of independence. When the session adjourned, the council left convinced they had demonstrated control. The humans rose slowly, methodically, their exit as deliberate as their silence. They had neither yielded nor protested, only observed, and the lack of open defiance was misread as acceptance. What lingered in the chamber afterward was not triumph but something quieter, less tangible. A faint unease, as though the silence carried edges sharper than words. Some noticed it in the humans' eyes, in the way they had not once lowered their gaze. But the council elders dismissed these doubts, eager to believe their authority unshaken. They failed to understand that in the absence of submission, in the presence of unspoken defiance, something irreversible had begun to take shape. The second day of deliberations began with the council projecting its usual posture of superiority. Formal announcements declared the agenda, to define the acceptable future for humanity. Delegates rose one after another, their words polished by centuries of political theater, each speech circling the same message. Humans must surrender autonomy in exchange for the illusion of peace. They framed it as generosity, but the core demands were unmistakable. Colonies on contested borders would be dismantled, expansion beyond designated systems forbidden, and Earth itself placed under a regime of technological supervision. These measures were presented not as punishments but as safeguards, a way to ensure humanity did not repeat its reckless mistakes. The tone dripped with condescension. One elder compared humans to a species of clever predators that required leashes. Another called their advances admirable but dangerous, implying that left unchecked, humanity might plunge the galaxy into chaos. The chamber resonated with approving murmurs, affirming the narrative that the Council's oversight was both necessary and inevitable. From their perspective, the humans should be grateful for such structured mercy. The Terran delegation remained collected, their leader's gaze steady, his words precise whenever he chose to respond. He did not raise his voice, nor did he deliver long retorts. Instead, he used sharp corrections to dismantle misrepresentations. When an alien suggested humans had violated treaties, he cited the exact clause that had been ignored by the Council itself. When another declared humans had provoked hostilities, he listed dates and incidents where Council fleets had turned a blind eye to aggression by their allies. Each rebuttal was factual, stripped of emotion, but the weight behind them left no doubt of the anger held in check. The chamber grew restless. Some aliens whispered that the humans were ungrateful, blind to the magnanimity offered. Others shifted uneasily, aware that every accusation hurled at the Terrans was being turned back with evidence. Yet the arrogance of the elders prevailed. They doubled down, layering their conditions with hollow praise, declaring that humanity's passion could be redirected into serving the greater good if only they surrendered control. Memories of past betrayals lingered unspoken in the humans' silence. Council assurances of neutrality during earlier conflicts had proven worthless, leaving colonies exposed to raids and massacres. Promises of resource sharing had turned into one-sided exploitation. When human refugees pleaded for Council intervention, their cries had been buried under bureaucratic delays. The delegates in the chamber might not have remembered each incident, but the humans carried them like scars, and every empty platitude reopened those wounds. By the midpoint of the talks, the pattern had become obvious. The Council would not offer genuine partnership, it would only demand submission under the guise of order. The lead human finally broke the silence with a short address. His words were measured but unyielding. He acknowledged the Council's power, recognized their history, but dismantled the claim of moral authority. He spoke of treaties dishonored, of protection withheld, of lives sacrificed while the Council debated procedure. His voice did not rise, yet every syllable struck like a blade, exposing hypocrisy layer by layer. The chamber rippled with discomfort. Some species looked away, unwilling to meet the human's eyes. Others bristled, declaring his remarks offensive, a distortion of history. The elders, seated at the highest tier, dismissed his account as an emotional outburst, unworthy of serious weight. They believed that by ignoring his words, they could reduce them to nothing more than frustration from an inferior race. But the humans did not push further. They did not argue endlessly or plead for recognition. Instead, they sat back in silence, refusing even the symbolic gestures of agreement or camaraderie. They declined refreshments, ignored ceremonial trinkets offered as tokens of goodwill, and engaged with no attempts at small talk. Their refusal carried a clarity that no declaration could match. Whispers spread through the chamber, not loud enough to disrupt the official speeches but persistent enough to fracture the illusion of control. The council tried to reassert authority by rushing the agenda forward, insisting that final terms would soon be drafted. Yet beneath their show of confidence, unease thickened. The humans' restraint no longer looked like fatigue. It resembled preparation. Their every glance at one another, every moment of silent calculation, suggested something building beneath the surface. When the session drew to a close, the humans did not linger. They requested a recess in words so calm they seemed almost routine, but the weight behind the request was undeniable. It was not an appeal for compromise. It was a warning, subtle yet unmistakable, that the talks had reached a fracture point. The council, blind to the signal, assumed time would wear down human resolve. They convinced themselves that patience would yield compliance. They failed to recognize that the humans had no intention of bending further, and that the silence they mistook for surrender was already hardening into finality. The chamber was quieter than usual when the humans returned from their recess. Delegates noticed it immediately, though none would admit to the tension it stirred. The Terrans entered with deliberate steps, their movements synchronized, their expressions sharpened into a composure that left no space for interpretation. There were no gestures of courtesy, no acknowledgement of ritual. They sat in silence, each one aligned as if following an unspoken command. The council believed they still held the advantage, but unease began to settle like a shadow across the ornate hall. The presiding elder invited the human envoy to speak, expecting another round of clipped remarks. Instead, the diplomat rose, his posture straight, his tone calm, and his words precise in a way that froze the chamber. He declared that humanity would no longer accept dictates dressed as peace. He stated plainly that Earth and its colonies would not dismantle what they had built, nor would they limit their fleets at the command of those who had proven incapable of protecting their own decrees. The message was not lengthy, nor was it dressed in ornament. Each sentence landed like a verdict. The chamber shifted. Murmurs rose, some sharp with outrage, others heavy with disbelief. One alien delegate shouted about insolence, demanding immediate censure. Another called for sanctions, his voice rising with the panic of someone who had never imagined defiance in this hall. Yet the humans did not waver. Their envoy finished his statement without raising his voice, and then he sat, the silence afterward louder than any protest. The council expected debate, negotiation, or a plea for reconsideration. None came. Then the human delegation stood as one. Chairs scraped back in perfect unison, boots striking the polished floor with deliberate rhythm. They did not look at the shouting delegates, nor at the elders presiding above. They simply turned and began walking toward the chamber's exit. The echo of their steps filled the hall, steady and unbroken. For the first time in generations, the carefully maintained order of the council fractured not from war but from refusal. Chaos erupted. Delegates called out, some ordering the humans to stop, others begging them to reconsider. The presiding elder attempted to restore control with demands for order, but his voice was drowned in the rising clamor. Guards shifted uneasily, their hands hovering near weapons though no command had been given. The sight of humans leaving without hesitation carried more weight than any armed confrontation could. Their silence was absolute, their defiance undeniable. As the heavy doors closed behind them, the chamber descended into discord. Some shouted for immediate punitive action, insisting humanity's arrogance could not go unanswered. Others, more cautious, urged restraint, warning that to provoke humans further would invite a response none of them could afford. Accusations flew between factions, some blaming the elders for pushing too hard, others blaming the younger delegates for showing weakness. The chamber that once embodied authority now quaked under the realization that it had lost control. The symbolic power of the moment was undeniable. The council had built its identity on the notion that no species could stand outside its authority. Now, before their eyes, an entire delegation had done exactly that without a single act of violence. There had been no bargaining, no pleas, no hesitation, only a clear rejection. It was not rebellion announced with fire but sovereignty claimed with silence. Whispers spread rapidly among the observers, representatives of smaller powers who often relied on the Council's protection. Some saw danger, others saw opportunity. The humans' departure ignited questions that had long been suppressed. If one species could walk away, why not others? The chamber's grandeur suddenly felt diminished, its rituals hollow, its authority brittle. The presiding elder struck the podium for silence, his voice trembling beneath its practiced authority. He declared the humans reckless, fools who would regret their defiance. Yet even as he spoke, doubt threaded through his words. The image of their unified departure lingered in every mind. For the first time, the Council realized their dominance was not unquestionable. Humanity had not shouted, had not fought, had not begged. They had simply walked away, and in that act, they had delivered a wound to the Council's pride deeper than any battlefield defeat. The aftermath of the withdrawal was immediate. Across the galaxy, trade channels that had relied on human fleets grew uncertain as convoys rerouted towards safer space. Merchants who once counted on Terran escorts found themselves negotiating with pirates or hiring unreliable protection from smaller powers. The sudden absence of human patrols created gaps no other species seemed prepared to fill. For those who had quietly depended on Terran discipline, the void felt like a warning of what was to come. Inside the Council, arguments raged. Some demanded immediate sanctions, others whispered about mobilizing fleets to enforce compliance, while a quieter faction urged reconciliation before the damage spread further. But no consensus could be reached. Every session devolved into finger-pointing, with elders accused of arrogance and younger delegates accused of weakness. Each speech highlighted how fractured the body had become without a common enemy or a unified voice to blame. The humans had left, and with them, the fragile illusion of authority slipped further away. Reports filtered in from the borders. Human shipyards were accelerating construction, new warships sliding from docks in numbers that made the Council nervous. Colonies once lightly defended bristled with fortifications. Civilian outposts now hosted orbital guns and fighter patrols. Where other species might have begged for inclusion, humans were preparing for exclusion, their movements deliberate and coordinated. Every intelligence briefing that reached the Council deepened the sense of unease, for it was no longer possible to dismiss them as reckless. They were preparing with intent. Smaller civilizations began to act independently. Envoys quietly slipped from Council space to Earth and its allied colonies, seeking private agreements. Some offered trade in exchange for protection, others sought guarantees of neutrality should conflict erupt. These were powers long ignored in the Council chamber, voices drowned beneath the weight of dominant species. Now they saw in humanity an alternative path, one not bound by the rigid hierarchy that had defined galactic politics for centuries. The Council noticed, but it could do nothing to stop the shift without admitting weakness. The absence of human delegates at official sessions grew more pronounced each day. Where once their silence had unsettled, now their empty seats haunted the chamber. Discussions about territorial disputes, trade routes, or enforcement of regulations all carried the same unspoken question: what would the humans do? The lack of an answer weakened every decision, as though the galaxy itself had grown lopsided without their presence. Even those who had once mocked Terran assertiveness found themselves missing the sharp edge of their clarity. Among the elder species, denial remained strong. They insisted humanity's absence would be temporary, that no race could thrive outside the Council's order for long. Yet their words rang hollow, undercut by the growing instability around them. Crime surged in sectors where human patrols had kept order. Smugglers expanded operations, emboldened by the lack of Terran enforcement. Even humanitarian missions faltered. Colonies that once relied on shared convoys faced shortages without Earth's logistical precision. Every shortfall traced back to the same point: the Council had underestimated the weight humans carried. Psychological dread began to take hold. In private, delegates recalled human soldiers in earlier conflicts, their relentlessness, their refusal to yield even when outnumbered. The thought of such a species preparing without restraint disturbed even the most confident voices. The Council had forced them into independence, and now the consequences spread like cracks through glass. The more the elders tried to frame the humans as reckless, the more it became clear they were the only ones acting with focus. The silence that once seemed like compliance now echoed as judgment. The chamber's grandeur no longer masked its fragility. Every ornate speech rang hollow, every declaration of order sounded brittle. Humanity's absence had become its own kind of presence, a reminder that authority depended not on ceremony but on recognition. By walking away, the Terrans had withdrawn recognition itself, and with it, the foundation of council dominance. In private corridors, whispers grew bolder. Some asked whether the council had made a mistake, others whether humanity's path should have been embraced rather than suppressed. For the first time, doubt overshadowed arrogance. The absence of war was not peace. It was a pause, heavy with consequence, and the galaxy could already feel its weight pressing down. Intelligence reports flowed into the council chambers like unwelcome tides. Human fleets were no longer scattered or hesitant. They were reorganizing with precision. Scouts noted vast shipyards operating around Earth and its colonies, each one expanding production at speeds that unsettled analysts. New alliances began to surface in intercepted communications. Minor civilizations once ignored were now reaching agreements with humanity, their leaders swayed by promises of protection without the weight of council oversight. The pattern was unmistakable. The Terrans were no longer playing within old boundaries, and their absence had created a parallel order outside the council's reach. Council elders gathered in closed sessions, debating the scale of the threat. Some argued for confrontation, insisting humanity could not be allowed to challenge centuries of established dominance. Others countered that war would expose weakness more than strength, for every clash would reveal just how much humanity had already grown. The arguments circled endlessly, yet each round ended the same way, with no action, only indecision, while the Terrans continued building momentum beyond their borders. Delegates began revisiting recordings of the walkout, analyzing every gesture and phrase. They slowed the footage, scrutinizing the measured tone of the human envoy, searching for signs they had missed. Some noted the precision of his words, each one chosen to close doors rather than leave them open. Others pointed out the unity of the delegation, the deliberate timing of their departure, the echoing steps that had silenced the chamber. These details now seemed less like spontaneous defiance and more like a carefully orchestrated statement. The realization spread that the council had not simply lost an argument, it had been dismissed in a manner that stripped away its authority. Across the galaxy, news networks replayed the walkout, framing it as the moment one species stood against the weight of empire. Minor civilizations that had long endured the council's condescension began to whisper openly about following humanity's path. Dissidents and reformers cited the Terrans as proof that independence was possible. Even in council-controlled regions, the story took root, becoming a symbol of resistance. The humans had not sought to inspire rebellion, yet their refusal had ignited something the elders could not extinguish with decrees. The council attempted damage control, issuing statements portraying humanity as reckless and unstable, yet the narrative rang hollow. Evidence of their growing power contradicted the message. Reports of successful trade routes managed independently of council oversight undermined every claim of recklessness. Each human achievement became a counterargument against the elders' proclamations, eroding the credibility of their authority. In private reflections, some elders admitted what they could never say aloud. Humanity unsettled them because it reminded them of what they had once been. Long ago, the founding species of the council had burned with the same relentless drive, the same refusal to accept limits. Over centuries, their fire had dulled into ceremony, their power tied to tradition rather than conviction. The humans, by contrast, carried no reverence for ritual. They embodied raw determination, and by walking away, they revealed how fragile the council had become. The chamber grew quieter with each session. Speeches were still made, votes still taken, but the weight was gone. Every decision felt incomplete without Terran acknowledgement. Their absence had turned into a haunting presence, a reminder that authority existed only so long as it was recognized. And the humans had withdrawn that recognition entirely. The elders began to realize that the galaxy had shifted, not through war or conquest, but through refusal. What unsettled them most was not what humanity had said, but what they had not said. No declarations of war, no threats of retaliation, no promises of destruction. Only finality. They had chosen a path of independence that could not be undone, and the galaxy was left to adjust. For the Council, the revelation was bitter. Their mistake was not merely arrogance, but blindness. They had mistaken silence for submission, patience for weakness, restraint for defeat. In truth, the humans had been measuring, waiting, preparing. Now the consequences were unfolding, and the Council could do nothing to reverse them. The final truth settled like a weight none could shake. Humanity had not fought to stay within the Council's order. They had walked away and, in doing so, had shown the galaxy that walking away was possible. Authority once thought eternal had been broken without a battle. The elders understood, at last, that the greatest danger was not human fleets or weapons, but the idea they carried, that no power was absolute, and no council invulnerable.